So I want to start today by going backwards, by taking us back about 5 or 9 or 23,000 years ago. So will you go back with me? Journey back with me 5 or 9 or 23,000 years ago to a group of people who are laying out sheaves of grain on a pile of rocks that they have gathered and formed together. And as we get in closer to this pile of rocks, we realize that for them, it's an altar. It of course doesn't look anything like Gina's altars at Kingstown with tiered levels and gorgeous layered fabrics and symbols of our faith. It's just a pile of rocks, and these people are laying out this grain on their altar. This altar of rocks, because they want to show their gods how grateful they are for the food that will keep their families alive for the months to come. They've learned over time that for this grain to grow, they need the rain to fall at just the right amounts and the sun to shine at just the right times and the crops to be protected from any disease or animals that might eat the seeds. It takes a whole lot of good fortune for a harvest to be plentiful, and they are so aware of their impotence in the face of all the potentially destructive forces that could come their way. And so they have begun this ritual of sorts, of gathering rocks together into a pile and taking a portion of their crop and offering it back to the rain god and the sun god and the protector god as a way of saying thank you, as this act of worship, hoping to keep the forces on their side, right? So that they'll continue to have abundant harvests, so that they can continue to feed their families. Now jump ahead with me a few thousand years to that same hill again. Only now, there's not just this pile of rocks. There is a temple and an altar within the temple. And there are these people walking around in robes, and they're taking the sheaves from everyday ordinary people, and they're bringing them and placing these sheaves on the altar. If the pile of rocks did the job, why the temple now? Because as the years progressed and the offerings multiplied, the same questions arose time and time and time again. Were they doing enough to please the gods? Maybe they needed to be more hospitable to the gods, more welcoming, or maybe if the gods took up residence in their midst, things would go better for them. And so they built this temple, this house for the gods. But of course, with this growing religious system and its rules and its rites came the increasing awareness of how many things could go wrong. What if they said a wrong word or made a wrong gesture? What if they made an offensive act before the gods? What if they gave a flawed sacrifice? Who knows what could make the gods mad? What could set them off? How do you know that the drought you're experiencing isn't because somebody improperly offered his sacrifice, inadvertently provoking the wrath of the rain god? How do you know? And so gradually from among their midst, this special class of people emerged called priests, who wore special garments to alert, like this, alert who they were and that they were to oversee all of this ritual and this offering. These people set apart, devoted to the life of the temple, charged with the responsibility of making sure that everything was done in the way that was most likely to bring favor to the gods. And now imagine that you're a young a woman who just discovered that you're pregnant and you want your child to be healthy and whole. Or imagine that you're the younger brother in the family and you didn't get the family inheritance. So you have to work extra hard, so much harder, to make a life and a living for yourself out of nothing. Or imagine you're sick and you don't know the root of it. No one seems to have any answers, but all you want is to be healed, made clean, so that you won't die before you get to see your daughter married. Imagine you're newly pregnant, or a young man trying to build a living, or an old man at death's door, and what do? And you leave your house, right? And you go up to the temple. You leave your common, ordinary, everyday space and you go up to the holy, sacred, divine space where you meet with the priests, those holy, sacred, uncommon people set apart from the masses to do the holy, sacred work of running the temple and organizing the sacrifices and keeping the gods pleased. You go to the temple. You do this because your life is divided into two kinds of space and time. There is the sacred and there is the common. There is your house and there is the temple. There is the holy and there is just the ordinary. There is the divine and there is the everyday. This is what you do. You would never take your dog into the temple area. God forbid. In the same way that you would never expect a priest to show up at your house to unclog your drain. So there are a couple of notable things for us to mention about this trip we just took into the past. Thank you for going on that trip with me. There's a couple of things to note here. First, all of this emergence of altars and temples and religious rites in human history, it was not a bad thing. It was an early thing, but it was not a bad thing. It was early in the evolution of humans when we became so very aware that our existence was at the mercy of forces beyond our control. This was actually quite a sophisticated development in human history. This was, as we talked about last week, a step ahead towards God's preferred future. It was the acknowledgement that there were dimensions to reality that are unseen. But secondly, going back 5 or 9 or 23,000 years ago shows us just how early we as humans began to divide the sacred life from the common life. You know we do this, right? We divide our sacred lives from our common lives. I was sent some survey by the United Methodist Church earlier this year where it asked us, how important to us were our spiritual lives? Our spiritual lives? As opposed to what? Our other lives? One of my favorite things to do, is to get coffee and to get to know people in our community or new people to our church. And I can't tell you how many times as I'm getting to know someone and their job or their profession comes up that they say something like, yeah, it's just one of those normal jobs. Not like being a pastor. Nothing spiritual like that. We divide what seems to be common from what is sacred. But what we mean when we say that God is so is that God in Jesus is helping us to leave behind this division between the sacred and the common, that God is the so, the life force, the answer, the reason, the integration of all, and bringing together all of humanity, so that in Jesus' death, the curtain in the temple of God, the one that kept the people out of the holy, separate from the sacred, is now ripped, is now torn. There is no distinction. We no longer move from common to sacred, from the home to the temple, to find the so, to find the meaning and the reason of our existence. Jesus just comes among us. Jesus just comes among us as God in a body, the divine and the human, existing in the same place, and in his death bringing an end to the idea that God is confined. Because the whole world then becomes the temple. The whole earth is holy, 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 as we sing with the prophet Isaiah. Or as the apostles named it, we are now the temple. Which leads us to our scripture today. Did you hear it as the Flores family read it for us? The Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus that God in Jesus is in all and through all, is the so of this life, is the reason for existence, and you don't have to go far to find the answers to your questions and the satisfaction to your longings and the reason for your life, because this God in Jesus dwells in you. Did you hear it? Paul writes to these Christians who have forgotten. Oh, how much they have forgotten this. Paul says, Paul writes, I beg you, friends, to lead a life worthy of this truth, this calling. For when God becomes the so of your life, you begin to live with all humility and all gentleness, with patience and long-suffering, with the ability to see each other and to hold each other in love, in union with the God who is so, who is the origin and reason of love, who is the origin and reason of peace. Paul goes on to talk about this God who is the so of our existence, as fully integrated, one body, one spirit, and residing in us, so that we might know and live into this one integrated life, not divided among sacred spaces and times and our common spaces and times, but as we were called in one hope, one faith, one baptism, one Lord, one God, who is in all and through all, who into Christ our head, our reason, our so, knits the whole body, every ligament together in love. Paul writes to this church in Ephesus, reminding them that God is so. Some of the ancient sages of the faith say that when Moses comes across the burning bush, he doesn't take his sandals off because suddenly the ground becomes holy, which is what we typically say. He takes his sandals off because he's just now realizing that the ground has been holy the whole time. This is what Paul is calling the church in Ephesus back to, this knowledge, this remembrance that because God and Jesus is so of all life, they are on holy ground wherever they are. And Jesus comes to let us know that the whole world is a temple, because we're temples. All of life is spiritual. All space is sacred. All ground is holy, because the whole earth and all that is in it is holy, holy, holy. temples than churches like Kingstown. Church services and worship gatherings like this one right now continue to have their place and prominence and power. They do. They have their place and prominence and power in our lives to the degree that moms and business owners and lawyers and those who stock shelves at the grocery store and teachers and farmers have their place and prominence in life. And that's because if all is sacred, then we sure as heck better tend to it. If God and Jesus is the soul of our lives, the reason for all existence, then we sure as heck better carve out time to worship that God and to reorder and reintegrate our lives again and again and again and again until we are living and breathing and moving in that one hope, one faith, one Lord of all. Friends, in spite of all the ways that we live split and detached and compartmentalized lives, we know that this is not how it's supposed to be. Because our bodies and our minds and our hearts and our consciences long to be united. I want you to hear today from a couple in our church who are on this journey of having their minds and their hearts and their consciousness united on this journey of integration in their lives where the common and the sacred meet. Would you listen in today as with charitable ears as Claire and Ryan share with us how they are coming to know this God who is the soul of their lives, how this God is continuing to pull them and coax them ahead.